Dawn bled into the gift like a slow breath, pale and cold, the light catching on frost crystals that filmed the boles of thin birches and the gray grass. The wall held half the sky, a sheer blue-white that drank color and sound. The new granary's beams threw long black ribs across the snow, and the rasp of saws swam thin in the air. Smoke from the charcoal pits hung low as if reluctant to rise into all that emptiness above. Jon Snow wrapped his glove tighter where the seam had split and watched two boys from Molestown lift a beam into place with Tormund shouting at them. His beard a tangle of rhyme, his voice all laughter and burr. The boys grinned in spite of the cold. Ghost stood to Jon's left in a drift, white fur haloed, eyes like banked coals, head turned toward the wall as if listening for something only wolves knew. "They'll swear at you in a day's time and call you old," Jon said when Tormund thumped down beside him, satisfied as a man after a good meal. "And you'll live to see it." "I'm not thinking on living to anything," Tormund said, hawked, spat, then stamped his boots. "I'm thinking on eating, and this place gives a man honest thoughts. Would meet walls if we can hold our hands steady. Your builders are soft but better than half the thieving southlings. And you, boy, you look like the wall tastes of iron again." "I'm thinking on winter," Jon said. "That's what I said." A raven beat low over the granary, a scrape of wings, dipping to the mews they'd built in the lee of the carpenter's shed. The bird's feathers were glossy as oil. It croaked once, twice. Jon did not move. From here he could see the outline of Queenscrown half a mile away, the old tower raised in the days when a dragon queen had come north and asked a king to give the watch more land. The tower's crown wore snow like a crone's cap. They had cleared brush from around it, rebuilt a ring wall of turf and stone, raised tents and plank houses where the snow stayed shallow, and the place had grown around the old crown like a stubborn shoot around a dead stump. A man in the black and white of the builders came down the track from the mews with his shoulders hunched and his cheeks raw. He handed the tube to Jon and was off again for the fires without entirely turning his back to Ghost. Jon warmed the leather in his palm before sliding the stopper, felt the wax crack without a sound. There were two strips inside tied together on thin cord. Samwell's hand on one, rounded, earnest, brisk on the other, a steward's scratch. He read both quickly, then again more slowly, and when he was done the cold seemed to bite deeper. Tormund, reading the set of Jon's face more easily than letters, grunted. "Bad tidings. Hungry tidings," Jon said. The Bar Rolands saw black mold on their rye, and the Mander froze early. White Harbor writes that their granaries can spare a tenth for spring, but not more, and they ask for timber in trade. Sam says he's sent copies of treatises on glass hothouses and a tract on composting heat as we asked. He's pleading with the Archmesters to spare 2 more to us. He thinks he can pry a healer away. Pleads with wrinkled men to send 1 old wrinkled man to a place at the end of the world, Tormund said, rolling his eyes. "We'll build our own wise heads if we have to, and feed them mush so their teeth don't fall out. Hothouses, piss-warm turnips in jars, is that the gift? We should be hunting elk and roasting the whole beast with butter. But if your Sam says glass, we'll build glass." "It's not piss," Jon said and almost smiled. "Well, not only piss." He folded the strips and slid them back into the tube. "We need more stonecutters, more lime. We'll send Davos to talk to White Harbor. If Wyman Manderley is gone to his gods, his grandchildren can reckon the worth of good timber. We'll trade for shell and make mortar strong enough for vaults. We've mine shafts south and west that starved decades ago. There's old stone piled everywhere. Send Davos," Tormund allowed. "He smiles like a clever dog, and all of them like honest men when they can smell it." One of the builder boys cried out then, a sharp "Oi!" as a plank slid and an arm went numb under weight. Tormund bellowed. The boys righted the load. Jon watched it steady and made himself turn his eyes back to the men walking in from the King's Road. It was a small party, the better for this winter, which trimmed everything down to bone and will. 2 mountain clansmen walked at the fore with axes over their shoulders, their tartan cloaks pulled up over their ears. Behind them were a dozen more in mismatched armor, thin polearms, patched mail, a squad that could have been thrown together out of any 3 blown villages in the Riverlands. Their captain rode an ugly brown mare whose legs were clean as if the stable boy had spent an hour scrubbing them. She had a stitched saddle and brass rings set in leather that had seen careful oiling. The rider had a pin at his throat in the shape of a trout. "Riverrun," Tormund guessed. "They come this far with fish when the sea is frozen? Or for bread," Jon said. They met the party at the edge of the trampled yard where the snow had gone to dirty ice, 30 paces from the granary skeleton. The captain swung off the mare. He had the wind-burned look of too many open days, a spear scar down one cheek that would never entirely let him grow a beard. He bowed, awkward and full as if the motion didn't sit right in his bones, and pulled off his glove. "My lord," he said and swallowed. "We didn't know whether to say lord or, well, I am Harold Page, sworn to House Tully. We bring a petition and men to work for food." "Food we can speak of," Jon said, taking the offered hand briefly, then stepping aside as men and axes and the mare's breath made their small weather around them. "We don't say lord much here. Jon is what I'm called. Or Snow, if you're angry with me." That earned him a short breath of laughter. "Are from one of the mountain men." "I," the man said. "Snow fits the place." He went off and stood staring up at the wall as if it might move. Page gestured a small way toward his men. "When Riverrun fell, the villages took the worst of it. We kept a bridge over the Red Fork as best we could. Then the sellswords came, hard men with hard looks who would swear to one king at sunrise and another by moonrise if the coin turned. We gave what we had to the holdfast, and when that was burned we began to walk. I heard there was a place in the gift where a man could get bread for work and no one would ask him to pick a side." Jon felt a small sting behind the eyes that was not from the cold. Dozens had come on the same rumor. Hundreds. The trampled common around Queen's Crown had grown into streets without them noticing. It had the shape that need gives to a thing. Sloppy, stubborn, inwardly true. "It's a hard bargain," Jon said. "You'll work harder than you have ever worked. We settle disputes with a council and by guest right, and we put a man into the stocks for taking what he has not earned. We don't burn a thief's fingers. You can swear to our peace or you can move on." "What if I have a king?" Harold Page asked as if to prove himself. "What if I keep him in my breast like a coin and rub him when I wake and sleep?" "Keep him," Jon said. "No one is taking the inside of you. If he asks you for your blood, tell him you promised it to the gift in bread and stone and the wall's shadow. We have our own war here, and it is against hunger." Harold gave it a beat. Then he nodded, as if something tender inside him had unknotted. "We'll earn our bread," he said. Ghost padded forward to sniff at the brown mare and made the horse shy. Tormund rumbled under his breath and thumped Jon on the shoulder once. A good blow that said speeches were for warm rooms. "You have 2 more parties coming up from the lake," the wildling said. "I sent Nora to meet them and show them where you want the latrines dug. See? E listen, Ido. Piss runs downhill. Piss and words both." "Both," Jon agreed, and watched the little troop settle like new snow into the pattern of the day. It would not be long before the ravens brought more tidings. Some with honest need, some with the oily sheen of offer and threat. He wondered how long before Sansa came. Winterfell had not sent him a raven in a fortnight, and that silence throbbed in his bones. The wind shifted and he smelled smoke as clean as pine lifted to frost, and behind that again the scent that his mind stuttered around and his heart knew. Heather on a southward wind, tar on rope, salt. Davos came in with the first mid-morning light like a tide that had learned to walk. There was no herald. The man did not know how to enter a place as if he owned it. He swung down from a mule with a smile that made his eyes crinkle and his scars pull tight. A boy as big as a young oak walked beside him carrying a blind man with care. Davos caught Jon in both hands, solid and unguarded. "My lad," he said, and then remembered himself and dipped his head. "My Jon, I brought you a man who knows lime and stone. I brought you hands. And I brought a letter that made me chew my lip, which my wife would say is a sin against my face." "I don't remember that in the 7-pointed star," Jon said, and meant to keep it light, but Davos's eyes had seen too many battles to mistake weight for a joke's bones. He passed the blind man to another pair of arms and dug inside his breast with gloved fingers, pulling out a folded letter bound with blue ribbon and sealed with white wax. The stag of Baratheon was pressed there. The wax had a flake of gold worked into it thin as skin. "She calls herself queen," Davos said. "The south is a forge and all the sparks are catching. She offers to recognize your neutrality and even to send ships to Deepwood Mott with salt and fish if you declare that the gift is the king's land, not the watches, and that you will hold it in trust for her until this storm blows through." "We've had that offer before," Jon said, looking at the stag. In his mind he saw Stannis Baratheon's thin mouth, blue eyes that cut. He saw the king's ship Black Betha riding low in Greywater's waters, saw a shadow that burned and a girl with a stag crowned who had clutched his fingers until the light went. He breathed once, made his hand unclench. "We are sworn to neutrality. The Night's Watch holds the gift by ancient law, given by kings not to be taken except by oath and need. I won't say queen or king in this place unless I am swearing a guest into my hall. And I have no hall." "You have a crown," Tormund said, his teeth white against his beard. "I can see it on your old tower. That was a joke. Laugh, boy." Davos looked at him with fond exasperation. "We should write back. If you leave a southerner waiting, she thinks you are measuring her throat for a blade. The Iron Bank sent a man to White Harbor, I hear. He asked for a levy against loans we never took, and he has tallies big as a book chained to his sleeve. Wyman's boy told me he would be happier to have us as partners than have them as masters of his ledger. He asked if we could keep our word." "We can," Jon said. "We'll give White Harbor timber and ore and men to help them dredge their harbor when the ice breaks. We'll take shell and lime from them as payment for leases in our forests. We'll stand the cost of new saws. I'll write to the Iron Bank and say nothing they will like." "How many men did you bring?" Davos shrugged, happy to lower the talk from crowns to hands. 42 with arms worth keeping, and another 60 with strong backs. 2 glassmakers' apprentices from Fairmarket. A woman who remembers the words to make the urine do as it should. He grinned at Jon's look. "My apologies to your elegance. She knows the glassmakers lie and says she can make it without burning up the wood we need to build with. There's a boy with an EA. Are for birds who beg to stand next to the muse. And salt beef until you can't stand the sight of it." Jon nodded to the men behind Davos, to the blind stoneworker whose sightless eyes had gone clear with some inward light at the sound of voices and tools. A man like that could stand in a doorway and tell the weight of a threshold by the echo of his footfall. A good builder. He felt the small prick of hope in the belly that a man gets before he realizes his body has counted numbers behind his mind's back. He turned to call for men to carry baggage and to fetch a room by the heat for the blind stoneworker, and saw a woman standing at the edge of the yard with a gray cloak that tilted heavy toward winter and hair like the inside of a chestnut, brown shot with red if the light laid a hand on it. For a heartbeat the world narrowed and deepened. The first time he had seen Queen's Crown, the tower had been a promise and a warning in the same breath. This time the woman was both. Sansa came without retinue, which meant she had left them half a mile back rather than cause a stir, her way. She stood with her hands in the muff and her feet set as if she could stand there for a quarter of an hour and nothing would make her shift. Her eyes took in Ghost, the wall, the bare skeleton of the granary, the river ice where the boys had broken a narrowing lane for water, and when they came to Jon there was warmth and there was calculation both, and neither canceled the other. "Brother," she said, and he felt something ease in his chest that had been wound tight for the length of a raven's flight. "Sansa," he said. They did not embrace. The air between them said they already had once, in a place too public and too full of spies, and had learned from it. He made space in his stance so she could step near, and when she did Ghost put his muzzle into her palm. She did not flinch. She had learned wolves. He was proud and a little sad. "You look thin," she said. "That's not criticism. It's a relief. All the men who get fat here are the ones who think they deserve to eat first." "I'm glad you came," Jon said. "Your letters grew polite." She tilted her head, a smile like a knife turning in a bright hand. "I learned it at King's Landing. It means I am thinking. It means I am seeing what can be done." She let her gaze flick to Davos and back. I brought you a letter. It is my habit these days. You and I grew up where we measured trust in dog teeth and who closed which door. Now we have to write. She pulled a small roll of parchment from the muff and handed it to him. The seal was a running direwolf, gray wax on gray paper. He cracked it with more haste than he should have. She did not seem to mind. The letter was short. It would bend a little if you held it up toward a candle. The words said, "The lords assembled at Winterfell have signed a pledge of neutrality in the wars of the South for 7 years, or until the end of winter, whichever breaks first. They will not march banners past the Long Lake without leave of a council held at Queen's Crown and witnessed by the Watch. They agree to send 1 in every 20 men who cannot hunt to the gift to work for bread. 1 in 50 of their stores to the granary of the crown. They agree to accept free folk as neighbors if you can bring them to it. In return, you will not draw sword marchward and leave the gift bare. In return, the Watch will watch. In return, you will take no crown and honor the oaths." In the margin was a smaller hand in pale ink. "I asked for harsher terms. They were afraid. I made them fear me more than they feared you. Do not waste it." He had to read the words twice before they stung. He looked up. "You made them fear you?" "I told them what would happen if men's children went hungry because they wanted banners," Sansa said. "They are not stupid, Jon. They saw the harvest. They know how knives come out when the flour is gone. Some of them hate me now. That is fine. It will keep them warm. They can wrap it around themselves in their beds. They will hate me more. Then we make that useful," she said, and took his arm and steered him as if she had never stopped bossing him in Winterfell's yard. "Show me the granary. Tell me why you put it there. Tell me how you mean to stock it. Tell me whether you mean to set guards on it at night. Tell me if you have men you trust to starve and say nothing when they have to. And then I will tell you where the knives are." They walked. The builders had worked a frost-hardened trench around the granary's footprint and packed it with rubble and lime and wet straw that smoked a little as the chemistry made its quiet heat. The skeleton's ribs rose from it in ordered lines, pegged and braced with wedges. A work song came and went across the yard, the words changing with the singer. When Jon told Sansa he meant to build the floors in vaulted rooms where the air would stay still and the weevils couldn't breed so fast, she nodded but did not pretend to understand. Davos fell in and out of step as he talked to the blind builder, who stood with his face turned to the sun and the back of his hand against the wood as if he could read it. A boy ran up with a face like a lit hearth and blurted, "They came! The children from Hardhome that Nora brought? They came," and then cocked his head as if expecting someone to strike him for speaking out of turn. Sansa turned first. She was quick where she was soft. "How many?" 14 and a woman," the boy panted. "2 of the girls don't have shoes. They were wrapped in skins. Nora says the little one is the one who sang on the ice. The little ones get the cold worst," Jon said to Sansa. "We'll set the cabins with the clay stoves near the north wall. I know it seems foolish. You'd think the sun's the warmer side, but it is the wind in winter that kills. The wall breaks the wind. We built windbreaks out of brush along the lanes." He heard himself talking and knew he sounded Lee, an old farmer. He could not make himself stop. "You have work enough for 10 men, Sansa said. "That's a good feeling. It leaves less room for pictures in the mind." He was saved from having to answer by Dolorous Ed, whose gait had not changed at all. He looked like a man walking toward a thing he did not want to see and a bed that would not ever be warm again. He had a new scar on his lip that turned one corner down lower than before, so now his mouth always looked like it had been bad news too long. "You have a meeting," Ed said to Jon without preamble. 2 embassies in one day, and I told our cooks to save the bile for anyone who thought to ask for supper before they have their names written down. And there's a man who says he's an Umber, only he can't remember his own father's name and keeps saying the word salt in a way I do not like. He tried to piss on the wall. The wall did not piss back. I told him that's the only luck he's likely to have for a month. "Who are the embassies?" Jon asked. "Golden lions and a red rose," Ed said. "A lion that still has meat on its bones, you'd be surprised. And the rose is a bush in a pot, far from any garden, and frightened of the frost. They have pretty clothes and ugly feet. The rose asked about our glass gardens, as if she meant to lay down in one and pretend it's summer. Sansa's mouth thinned. Tyrell. Or what the reach grew after the storm, Davos supplied. It could be a cousin or a new graft on the old branch. Men who serve the harvest don't like to say they serve the house, but they bring their purses just the same. Jon looked to the wall, which had been watching them without moving. His breath smoked. We'll host them both, he said. We'll set them in the tents facing the wall, opposite sides, and each can see the other freeze. We'll give them stew and tell them what stew it is. We'll tell them if they want seed they must send us their sick and their children and their skill. They can keep their banners if they can teach us to spin a rope quicker. Ed, have the oath read to them before they step farther than the gate. Sansa, will you sit beside me? I will, she said, and he felt again the old easy ache, the one that ran through blood instead of around it. And I will count their rings and tell you which ones are real and which are gilt. They met the envoys in the long tent they had built with planks for walls and canvas for a roof. A scratch hall stinking of straw and smoke that had nonetheless a hearth at each end and benches built from planks salvaged off ships that had never come this far north and now never would. Jon took the center of the long side. Ed stood behind him with his arms folded and his face set in its natural mourning. Sansa sat to Jon's right with her hands folded in the sleeves and her face as quiet as a lake in frost. Ghost lay under the table with his chin on his paws, not asleep and not entirely awake. The lion envoy wore pale cream white pale gold over a cured ruin of a body that had been made to stand straight and had forgotten how. He had pretty hands, long and clean. The Rose's man was young, cheeks raw and eager to please, wearing green so bright it made the eye ache until it got used to it. Jon listened to each make his speech as if he were listening to the rhythm of ice groaning on the river. They had the same shape, different notes. The Rose said, "We are rebuilding the winelands and the mills along the Mander. We can send seed and vines if you will plant them in warmed houses with our men to tend, and we would have a claim, no larger than your hand, on the wine for 7 years and a day. We ask for you to declare your neutrality not only in marching men, but in embargo. No grain shall march southward to the lion's side. We will fund a sawmill and send a man with hands like a weaver's to tend it." The lion said, "Winter comes hardest to the riverlands, and the lion's land has grown used to fat. Do not let that fool you, we learn lean too. We can send iron and tools if you will swear that you remain under the king in name, whoever holds the throne by law, and that you will take a man of ours to sit in your council and watch. Your free folk made trouble in Lannisport once. You will give us a guarantee." Jon let each hang for a heartbeat in the air. He gave stew to both men and said the word stew and waited for both to taste it and be surprised. Then he said, "We are not a house. We are a wall with a road and a granary. We are a place where men are asked to lay down their quarrels before they cross the ditch. We have no need of vines here. We drink weak beer and water thickened with flour. But we will take your sawmill and we will take your toolmaker. He will swear our oath, and he can stand over any man's hands and make him better. You can have your share in lumber, not wine." He turned to the lion and said, "If we are under any king, he is cold. The ancient law gave the gift to the night's watch for all kings and all winters. We have a watch still, and they will not suffer a man with a lion pin to tell them who to feed first. You can send tools. We will send you a list of our needs. We will send you a man to stand in your markets and barter for us with your merchants, and he will be a reacher by birth if that pleases you, or a Dornishman, or a Northman who has learned to count, but he will be mine. That is my guarantee, that I will not swear a thing I cannot keep in the face of a child." Ghost breathed and stirred. Sansa's hand moved within her sleeve and stilled. The lion envoy's mouth tightened at the corner. The Rose's man chewed and swallowed and smiled without knowing he smiled. Ed shifted his weight behind Jon and said quietly, "I hope we don't eat all that stew. It was good." Later, after the oaths were read and the envoys had rubbed their hands beneath their cloaks and thought themselves unseen, Sansa went to the far end of the tent to look at the drawings they had pinned. There, with scraped bone pins, sketches of the granary vaults, layouts of the compost heaps, a map of the gift with its empty villages and its slowly filling ones in red ink. Jon stood looking at the hard lines of the table's edge, thinking about a boy with a trout pin and a hungry look, and a woman from hard home who had lost 3 children and still sang, and he could feel the muscle in his jaw tighten. He was thinking of the cut you make in yourself when you refuse a crown, the old dream that if you do not take it, someone else will carry the weight. It is a lie. The weight finds you anyway. It just has a different name. He felt Sansa at his shoulder and did not need to look to know her expression. "What?" he asked. "I counted rings," she said. "The lions are true gold. He took them off his right hand to eat and would have liked us not to notice. He is a man who has lost something he never thought he would lose and thinks only money will hold him now. The rose's rings are half-paced. He will bend quickly. He is used to bending and calling it a dance. Will they keep to their words? They will keep to what is useful," she said calmly. "It is something. I do not know if you should have given the rose the sawmill. If we build it ourselves, we have to feed the men while they learn. We will feed his and feed ours too. The timber won't wait. Winter isn't a speech. It chews." She made a soft sound. "You would have starved well as a crow." "I starved as a crow," Jon said, and smiled without thinking. The shape of it surprised him when it reached his face. He did not sleep that night. The grumbling of the camp rolled and broke like low surf. Somewhere outside, a child cried and then did not. A woman sang in a tongue that had never had a word for summer. The fires crackled, and in the long tent, he could hear the envoy from the Reach snore delicately like a man practicing restraint even when unconscious. Jon lay in his pallet and watched the tent wall darken with shadow and thought of the raven's tube in his pack and the blue wax that had flaked with gold, and the short letter with the gray seal burned like a coal in his memory. The attack was almost gentle at first light. The men who made it were careful. That was what saved them. The guard at the ditch was called Garrett. He had a wife who had died on a spring afternoon and a daughter who would be 20 at harvest if harvest came. He had stood the night in the cold and had been sent off to sleep in a cabin nearer the wall, and he had taken 2 paces and then come back because he had left his old hat where he had hung it on a rung to dry. He had crossed the ditch again, and he was at the right place at the right time when a dark shape moved with purpose where there should have been none. He saw a tuft of black wool where no man would wear it, and he did the first thing a man from the north does when something wrong moves. He spoke to it. "You there," he said, and the wrong shape stopped and rose another 6 inches, showing a man's bulk where it had crouched. The man did not answer, and Garrett had the breath and luck to call again, louder, and to put the horn to his mouth and blow, and for another man farther down the ditch to hear it and not believe he'd heard it and then hear it again and believe. The bell at the mews clanged as someone inside thumped it with a hammer. Steam lifted from the heated troughs and rolled like ghosts. The first arrow came hissing low, too low, and Jon realized their enemy did not know the ditch the way they did. By the time he had his sword in hand and his boots half-laced, there were 3 men dead by the ditch and 4 more fighting on the snowy slope with axes and knives. Their armor gleamed like oil. They had covered their faces in wool and smeared them with ash. Tormund came out roaring with a spear in one hand and nothing in the other. He grinned like a man about to bite into an apple. The lion envoy was there, too. His white coat blotched suddenly with something dark, his mouth a thin wound. He had a sword he knew well enough to keep out of men's way and no better. Jon shouted for Ed and for Davos, and men woke up quick as dogs and came. The free folks' arrows went out like rain. The invaders had taken the ditch in pieces with plank bridges and pushed them in and come across silent, the kind of silent that speaks of coin and planning, not fear. They sought the granary skeleton and the plank houses where they thought the food would be. They had not seen the stone caves under the hill that did not smoke, where they had packed stores against thieves and dormice both. They had not thought the watch would send men to sleep there on purpose, to snore, to fart, to make it smell like a place men live. They took the wrong path and hit a wall of brush that had been frozen into the shape of a hedge. Jon met the first of them there, and then everything in him went very simple and very still. He fought as he had been taught. Half-step, guard, honest footwork. He did not let the man he was cutting be a man. He let him be a shape with a sword. The shape's blade slid off his guard, and he gave back weight and took it, and the shape moved as shapes do, and he let it run onto his point, and then he turned as quick as he could and took another into the hollow where the shoulder meets the neck. He felt nothing. That was mercy. If you felt while you were doing it, you were a butcher and would come to love it. He had learned that once on a black night on a narrow path above a frozen lake with a girl he loved behind him. He did not want to learn it again. By the time the sun came up, the men who had come in quiet were dead or bound with cords at wrist and ankle, kneeling in the churned snow under the old tower. The lion envoy had a cut along his forearm that had bled enough to stain his fine sleeve all the way to the elbow. He stood stiffly, refusing the look of shock that hounds every man after the first battle he did not cost himself. The Roses man had vomited in the ditch and had done it as politely as his snoring. Ed stood with his arms folded and his mouth a line that would never smile again. Sansa had a piece of birch bark in her hand with charcoal marks on it and was counting bodies. 23, she said. 6 cloaks with the same stitching. Those are the captain's men. The rest are sellswords or worse. See the boots? No better than Riverland's boots, at least. She straightened. We'll have one talker who believes he can buy himself bread with the right words. They did. A man with a wide, friendly face and a missing tooth asked for warmth, and when he had that it was easier to make words. He had come up from White Harbor on a ship that had been given another ship's name, he said. He had sat at a table with a man who wore a ring with a lion and had said it meant nothing. He had taken coin with a fish stamped on it and had laughed because whoever had stamped it had done a bad job of the tale. He had been told the granary was full and that men with children were buried in the snow outside. And you believed that? Davos asked, not unkindly. It was not a question so much as a shape to set the man's voice against. I believed in coin, the talker said, and I believed I might get bread. Men say your granary is a story and a lie. Men say your story is better than their lie. He looked up at Jon, and something like fear and something like respect and something like hatred chased themselves in his eyes and could not catch. You're him, he said. You're the one who told the North to sit on its hands. There's a lot of men say there's blood on those hands. Jon stood very still. He could have said any number of words. They came and went in him like winds off the wall. He found the true one. There's bread on them too. They hanged 3 men, though it cost Jon sleep for 7 days and carved a hollow under his cheekbones. Ed said, we should hang them all. 7 and 70 if we must. It will save us trouble later, Tormund said. Cut off their hands and let them go, and they'll learn to gnaw better than any diver. Sansa said, hang the ones who took coin to burn food. Don't hang the ones who came hungry and fought because a man with a ring told them to. It was Sansa who called the names. Jon stood and did not look away. When the ropes went tight, Ghost made a soft sound and stepped backward once into the shadow of the old crown. They sent a letter to the lion with a seal of plain wax. Jon wrote it with his hand steady. It said, men with your gold tried to burn bread. If you can prove you did not send them, send us the man who wore the ring with your lion in his seal and the men who followed him. If you cannot, do not send men to us asking for grain. If you do not answer, we will not send a list of our needs. We will still send your children if they come to us hungry. Sansa said it was a good letter. Davos sent a copy with a second hand to a man he knew in White Harbor, a factor who had learned to keep 2 sets of books without losing both. The Roses man helped wash the blood off the ditch wall with a brush and warm water and did not complain about his hands. He said, I did not know what frost did when there was blood on it. Sansa told him. He nearly cried. After, he ate stew and it steadied him. They built the granary higher so the next attack would see more wood to burn and be less certain where the food lay. They set more men in the stone caves with orders to snore. They built the windbreaks heavier and trimmed the brush along the ditch into spear points. They took the children from Hardhome to the cabins with the clay stoves, and the woman from Hardhome sang at dusk in the shift of smoke. The blind mason listened to the walls and said it was good. The first glass house went up like a prayer anyone could see. They built it low, no higher than a man could stand in, along the south slope where the light, frail as silk, held longest. They packed manure and straw in stone-lined trenches and turned it with sticks until it smoked under the glass like breath. The boy who wanted birds caught 2 ravens with gentleness and worked like an ox with joy, and the blind mason told him where to hammer. In 3 weeks they had a place without wind where the damp breathed slow. They set boxes with earth and seed there, and when the first sprout came up and 2 women argued over whose it was, Jon stood between them with a hand on each elbow and said, "It is ours." And he saw something pass through their faces that was not exactly joy and not exactly grief and maybe, if there is a word for it, but only maybe steadiness. One morning, a fortnight after Sansa came, the snow fell as if it had decided finally to be earnest. It came in flakes like feathers and then in pellets that hit the canvas roof of the long tent and made a sound like beans in a jar, and then it came in a white that had no shape at all and ate the world. Men tied ropes along the lanes from shelter to shelter and walked leaning as if the air had turned to water and they were waiting. Jon stood in the granary with the blind mason and 2 boys with cheeks just past rounded and listened to the weight lay itself on the roof. "That is good," the blind man said as the snow began to make its own hush. "She sits right. Another pole there, though, and a better brace. Wood says where you should put it if you hear." "You don't hear Wood," one of the boys said, skeptical and trying not to be. "You touch it. You'll learn to hear with your hands," the blind man said. "It is all the hearing that counts. You can't trust the ear. It runs off with songs." Jon looked at the old man and thought that he trusted both, and also neither, and that was why he was tired to the bone. He took the brace in his glove and set it where the man's fingers made a small motion. To fit. He could not have said how, but he knew it. They laid up the stores then, passing CKs by hand in a line that moved like a river. Ed cursed with a tired sort of prayer under his breath. Davos slung sacks until Sansa came and told him he would pull his scars open if he did it any longer. And he glowered and surrendered with the good sense that it saved him more than once when wits would not. They shut the doors with bars when they were done and posted 2 boys with spears half as tall as Ghost. They were in that first hungry silence when the sound came. It was a bell, but so far away that all the familiar of bells fell away from it. It was thin and many and nothing at once, and it made the hair lift on Jon's forearms. The men at the granary straightened as if something had crawled up their spines. "Not ours," Ed said, voice flat. "A fisher did that sound once when a whale died and the ice wet down on it. I didn't like it then either." "It's beyond the wall," Jon said without wanting to say it. "We still hear beyond the wall," Ed said. "I wish I didn't." Men came through the snow like ghosts from a child's story. Rangers in black with frost caked in their beards like powdered sugar, and their eyes sunk into their faces until you wanted to put soup in them. The one in front was mager with a turnip nose and a laugh like stones. He didn't laugh now. He carried a bundle wrapped in his cloak that was probably a girl. When he reached the granary, he put the bundle into Sansa's arms with a care that made his hands gentle in spite of the stiffness. "We went farther," he said. "We saw blue where there should be black. It is quieter than it should be." "Quieter," Davos repeated in the tone of a man who does not necessarily want the answer and will take it funny when he hears it. "We found a camp," Magor said. "Ruined. Not by fire. Not by man. Not by wolves. I've seen a wolf's work. I've made a wolf's work. It wasn't that. It was a taking." He drew the word back as if it had burned his tongue. He pointed not exactly at the wall and not exactly east or west. His finger trembled. "Something has gone back where we pushed it from, and there is a hole in the snow where it slid." Jon felt the taste of iron in his mouth. He saw a girl with hair redder than Sansa's, fierce and tender at once, and her head breaking the snowline with laughter. He saw hard eyes blue as a fresh bruise. He tasted ash. He heard a whisper in the blood that said, "You did not finish anything. There is no such thing. You only hold the door long enough for other men to pass through." "We stand the watches," Jon said. "We do not march. That is our oath." Ed's mouth pulled down. "We hold the ditches and we lay the snares. We send the ravens to your friends with their pretty rings who want our wood and our seed and tell them to send us their boys and their arrows if they want there to be anyone left to drink their wines. We do not march." He met Jon's eye. "We do not march." They did not march. The wall's shadow deepened and the wind came down with teeth. Men broke ice with iron bars to water horses that were too weak for much else. The glass house held. In it the breath of seedlings stood like a thin fog, and the women went in by turns to warm their hands and then came out to carry wood. They fed the children every time the bell in the long tent struck the hour, even in the dark. The man with the rings might send men again. The blue might move again. The granary stood. When the storm slackened and the light took on the clear quality that comes after, they held a council in the long tent with its plank walls and the drafts cutting along the floor so that a man's boots had a breeze at the ankles. Jon took the center, Sansa to his right, Ed behind, Davos near with a sheaf of tallies and a face built for bad news and grace both. The men from the Reach had sent their sawyer, a slow-eyed man named Pate who had hands like a woman's and wrists like a snake's. The lion envoy had not sent the man with the ring and had not answered yet. The boy with the trout on his pin had taken to the way the winter pressed everyone down as if it had been made for him. "We need law," Sansa said after the talk had made a circle of itself 3 times like a dog bedding down. "Not only oaths and not only bread. Men who come need a word to say to themselves at night that will keep their hands where they should be, and a word to say to their neighbors when the neighbor is wrong that will keep him alive. We need a charter." "The Watch has its vows," Ed said. "You will like them very much until you see what they do to a boy who takes them in the wrong shape." "We will not ask boys to swear away what they cannot take back," Sansa said without heat. "We will ask them to say something to themselves and to us so they know what they are doing." "What would you have them say?" Davos asked. She looked at Jon. Then she said it. "I will not take coin to burn bread." It was a start. They laughed. A little. Then they began to speak and the words took the shape of something that might be said without shame. "I will take what I have earned and no more. I will share what I have more than need of. I will hold a blade but not for spite. I will shelter my neighbor when the wind goes wrong. I will speak true to the council and bear true witness when called. I will not wear a ring to set my bread above my neighbor's bread. And if there is a king away down a road I cannot walk, I will leave him to his own supper until spring." They argued each word to rags and then sewed it up again and made it better. The blind stoneworker listened and smiled without showing teeth. Pate said, "A man can work to this," and the Mountain Clan man said, "A man could sing to it," and did, a low rumbling line that made the hair on Jon's forearms lift. They would put the charter on a plank and hang it where men could not help but see it whenever they ducked into the long tent for warmth, and where children would trace the letters with their fingers and learn the shap. Yes, long before they learned the names. That night, Sansa and Jon stood outside and watched the breath of the camp go up to the low stars. The wall glowed faintly where the moon hit it. Ghost leaned against Jon's thigh until his weight pushed him off balance, and Jon let it. Sansa had a strip of old fur around her throat that had been their mother's. It made something in Jon ache in a way winter could not touch. "I thought of a crown today," she said abruptly, as if she had caught herself in a thought and felt obliged to confess it. "Not the kind you wear. The tower wears that. The kind that is a circle of people around a thing. Faces and hands." He looked at her. He could still see the girl who had believed in songs about princes. He loved the woman who counted rings. "We're making a circle," he said. "Circles narrow," she said, matter of fact. "You have to push them outward with your shoulders if you want anyone else in. It is heavy work. I have broad shoulders. You have tired shoulders." She reached out and laid her fingers on the seam of his glove where it had burst, and she smiled. "I stitched better as a girl." "Thank you for the neutrality," he said. "It could not have been easy." "It was easy," she said in a tone that made it clear it had been hard. "All the hard things are easy once you have decided to do them," Littlefinger used to say. She stopped herself and made a face. "Never mind what he used to say. I'd like to know." "He used to say that fear is a useful coin," she said, and shivered as if she had said a name that should not be said after dark. He was right, but he was only half right. Fear melts in the hand. Respect is The answer from the lion came 6 days later on a raven that shook its feathers furiously when the Muse man took the message tube as if it had been made to carry sin. It said, "The man with the ring is dead. He died at sea trying to come north." You cannot prove that I sent for bread to be burned. I cannot prove that I did not. I will send you no tools. I will send you no men. I will send you nothing but this. A word that not even the gold of Casterly Rock will buy the bread you bake. It is not a good word, but it is true. I have not much of those to give. Sansa read it without a tremor in her voice and placed it on the table. Jon wanted to hate the man whose mouth had formed those words, but he heard the shape of them and could not. They would get no iron from that quarter. They would scavenge what they had dropped in their own fields and make more out of it than a Southern would think possible. They would bind staves with rawhide and learn to wait. He took up quill and wrote, "Truth is bred in winter. Keep it for your children. If you change your mind, I will not hold you to it." He sealed it in plain wax as if the seal itself were a boast. Davos said, "I nearly like him." "So do I," Sansa said, and looked cross with herself for it. "He will not help us, but at least we do not have to spend time learning that. Time is a coin too." They named the granary. It seemed a foolish thing to call a building by a name that would not work for its keep, but it helped. The old name had been something drunk and kingly. They scraped it off and called it Alisanne's Cupboard. The old tower people had begun again to call Queen's Crown now wore a banner carved in wood and painted clumsy by a painter from White Harbor who tended the clay stoves. The banner was a loaf and a rope knotted properly, plaited the way a girl might plait her hair ready for work. The boy with the birds caught a girl from the Riverlands and fell in love. The blind mason taught the mountain men to tap stone and hear whether it would sing or crack. The sawyer from the Reach learned to put his hand on a free folk woman's shoulder to guide her past a blade and lost 2 rings and did not complain and made better sawdust after. They sent Davos south with 2 letters, one to White Harbor and one to Old Town, and a list. They asked for lime, flax, tar, glass sand, and wool. They asked for a healer, for a midwife. They asked for a book, a copy of some old treatise that would tell them how to make a kiln hotter with less wood. They asked for patience and promised payment in timber and fish and leather, and a thing that no ledger had yet a name for and would steal to itself one in time. Sam's reply came a month later with a roll of maps and a new tool with a peculiar hook and a letter half apology and half pride. He had convinced an archmaester to send a healer who had gone nearly blind. He had found the treatise on kills and sent it with 3 others because he could not decide which would be more useful. He had taken 2 vows to the Old Town Library that he had promised himself never to take and had set them on the table and pushed them forward like a man parting with kin. It was on the day they raised the second glass house. Men in their shirt sleeves for an hour at noon because even in winter a man sweats if he lifts enough. That Sansa came to Jon with a look on her face that made him step toward her before he had thoughts to lay behind his feet. "There is a girl at the gate," she said, "and a woman with hair like a raven's wing and a scar down her arm. They asked for bread and books." Jon wiped his hands on a rag and went. The girl at the gate had eyes such a dark brown they seemed black and hair like a night that had never quite made up its mind whether to come all the way. She held herself like a cat on the edge of a table about to jump, not all the way one thing or the other. The woman with hair like the wing had a smile that did not quite reach everything it should, and a scar down her arm that looked like it had come in some accident she had had with a man's pride. "You asked for bread," Jon said. "And books," the woman said. "I was told you have books. I was told you read them. I was told you let women read them." "We've never had enough to lend them out," he said. "I can't think why we would start now." He let the corner of his mouth move so she could see the shape of the T's and not take offense. Some women did not need the warning, some did. She tilted her head and smiled properly for the first time. "I have money," she said. "Not like the lion's money, the kind that spends better. I have 2 sisters who read, and a father who doesn't, and a brother who says that a woman who reads is like a donkey who sings, and he meant that as a compliment, which is the worst part. I brought my hands. I am quick with them, and I have no husband to tell me what I cannot do." She held up her hands and turned them so he could see there was nothing soft on them. "As for the girl, she does not know yet whether she wants to be a person among people. I thought you might teach her, or that she might teach you." The girl's eyes never left Ghost. She was not afraid. Ghost came forward and sniffed her fingers and did the thing that would make men jump as if they had been jabbed by a pike. He leaned his head into her palm. She caught her breath in a way Jon recognized. He had done it himself once, in a snowy wood with a wolf whose fur was as black as an unlit night. He felt something like a hand in his chest, turning. The woman watched him watch the girl and read something in it that made her smile like someone who had found a coin in the snow. "What's your name?" Jon asked the girl. "Gilly," she said. "Maybe. It was my mother's name. I keep thinking I should change it. Sometimes I want to be a river, sometimes a road. Sometimes I want to be a story no one recognizes." "We'll call you Gilly until you tell us otherwise," Jon said. And when he looked up, the woman had her head turned slightly to take in the wall without letting it know she was looking at it. The days took on the shape work gives them and made a winter men could live in. The council sat twice a week and heard matters that would have gotten men killed in better times by men with softer hands. A dispute over a kettle, a woman who had 3 lovers and found herself with child and wanted the council to decide which man should help her with wood because she thought if she let one do it and not the others they would make a mess. A man who had carved "we all eat" into a plank without asking and had spelled eat wrong. They did not always get it right. It said as much. They tried again. A boy stole a heel of bread and said it was because his father had beaten him. The father came and showed them a bruise where the son had stolen a knife. The boy went into the stocks for a day with hot stones under his feet so he would not lose toes. The father sat near him on a block of wood without being told and gave him tea when he shivered. The carved plank went up on the long tense wall. The wrong spelling stayed. It reminded men not to get proud. When the ice began to go off the river in plates as big as a man's floor, Davos came back with a smile he had not worn in 7 years and a bag of lime easier to carry than a child. White Harbor had kept its word, and the Iron Bank had found itself persuaded that a letter written in plain hand by a man who had once stood on a wall of fire and had not died at least required that they answer. Sam's book saved them enough would that Ed ceased to say the thing about hanging men for letting the kiln burn too hot. The sawyer Pate set his mill to humming and stood back and let his mouth open the way men's mouths do when they have made a sound like singing, and it was not their voices that made it. A party came from the Dornish marches wearing colors like sand and sky and brought with them flat bread like paper and cheese that had so much perfume Davos demanded to be allowed to wash afterward. They said that in the South men were talking of the gift the way the North had talked of Old Town once. They asked if they might send a man to learn how to feed a village that had no land left that was not flooded or burned. Sansa took them to the glass house and stood with her hands inside her sleeves while a man from the marches put his fingers to the glass and fogged it and wept until he was ashamed of himself. Jon stood outside and listened to him laugh a few moments later and thought there might be hope in laughing men who weep. They held a mood in spring. Not the sort of spring that poets talk of, but the sort that means the wind will kill you only half the time and the other half you have a chance to get your foot on a dry stone before you move it again. They sent ravens all the way south to the Trident and all the way east to the Fingers and out to Bear Island where the women had taught the seals to serve them and down along the White Knife to where men still believed that a river, if asked nicely, would carry a craft where it should. They asked each house to send someone who could make decisions, and they said in the letter, "Send us someone with hands roughened by work. If you send us someone with perfume, we will put him in the latrines the first day and see what he is made of." They came. The first day was a lesson. They did not know where to put their eyes. The wall took the breath out of them. The free folk did not. A woman from the Fingers who had lived on shellfish and salt until her bones begged for fat explained to a lord from the Rills how to braid a rope with 3 hands instead of 2. And in gratitude he told her how to turn a fish sauce into something that would keep for a month and not rot even when the weather remembered it was a warm-blooded thing. A man from Sunspear brought recipes for pickling roots. A small boy from the Crannigs watched and taught a girl from Dorne to stand in the ditch and feel the ice with her toes before she fell. Sansa sat on the bench with Crest behind her and counted rings until her mouth was pursed with concentration. And Jon watched her and loved her with the kind of love that cannot be put anywhere and does not need to be. They signed the charter on the 3rd day, each man and woman leaning over the plank where the letters had been burned into the wood and putting a mark where they wanted it to be. It was a crooked line. The old blind mason came and ran his fingers over the marks, and laughed softly. "What?" Sansa asked him, indulgently impatient. "They do not see it," he said. "We have made a house with letters. We will live inside it. It will keep the wind out better than many a wall." After the moot, The free folk and the Northmen and the South on their narrow-curled feet drifted through one another like currents meeting, eddying, catching, settling. A girl from the marches married a man who had never seen windmill before and then took him to see the sea. He threw up and embarrassed himself and then laughed so hard he embarrassed himself again. Men sent more letters asking for more things, and Sansa read them and made a face and picked up her quill and wrote back, and the letters she wrote were better than prayers. When the first harvest came, there was little glamour in it. The fields in the gift are not the fat brown squares of the Reach. They are a thready, stubborn thing that must be tricked into giving over with careful hands. But there was grain piled in heaps in the long tent where the council met, and a smell like beer scummed off it, and a sense you could not boil down a thing earned, not given. The children ran with flour on their faces like paint. Men with rings came to see if it was true and did not know where to stand so that they could see without standing in the way, and Sansa put them in the way and did not apologize. They sent grain south, not carts full like a lord would brag of, but sacks here and there to those who had sent hands. It tasted of north. Men cried over it the way men did not cry over wine. They sent letters with it that said, "If you have wood, send wood. If you have tar, send tar. If you have men with hands and no work, send them. We will give them work. We will give them bread." They sent none to the lion. Jon wrote another letter in the winter after and said, "We still have bread. If you still have truth, send it." He did not wear a crown. He wore calluses. He slept little and woke often and went from one end of the camp to the other with Ghost next to his knee so that men would know the wolf kept his secrets like a man and a man could keep his own. He sat with Sansa over bowls of stew that had no name other than stew and learned to listen to the council until he could tell when the truth was a hare beneath the bracken and when it was a stag on rock. He held babies sometimes when women pressed them into his arms, and sometimes they cried, and sometimes they looked up at him with that blunt, surprised look babies have when they are trying to decide whether the world is worth their time. Once a woman put a baby in his hands and he thought the child was like looking into a still pool in winter. He could see himself and he could not see himself, and the seeing did not help him either way. He was glad of the sound of saws then, the honest noise work makes when it is working. He went to the wall sometimes alone. He stood with his hand on the ice, and the cold soaked into him until the bones of his hand belonged to the wall and not to the hand. He thought then of men he had loved and men he had killed and men he could not decide which they were. He thought about a black-haired girl on a hill with her hands clenched into the fur of a wolf so fiercely her fingers had gone numb with it. He thought about the blue. He thought about the hole in the snow where something had dragged itself back along an old road. He did not leave the gift. That was his vow. Changed the shape of him. He had been a man of sudden roads and narrow paths and quick fights when all that stood between the world and the dark was the breath he took. Now he was a man of patience. He found that the dark took longer to come when you fed it less. He found the fear did not stop knocking, but that it knocked less politely and would sometimes go away if you ignored it. He found that men who would have cut a throat for a song would lay a rope down and carry a beam in a way that made him ache to watch because the way they held their faces when they did it was like looking on holiness. One autumn when the leaves went like rust and then like blood and then like paper, a man came up the King's Road with a horse too thin for respect and a long face like a shovel blade. He wore a robe that had once been white and was now the color of the inside of a cup you hadn't washed properly. He had a necklace of cheap silver with shapes stamped into it that might have been candles if a man squinted. He said he was a priest of the seven and that his faith had endured a burning and had come out baked. "We have candles," Ed said. "We have a God's wood too. We have everything but a good singer." He turned to Jon. "We could do with a song that isn't about going home or about kissing someone in a barley field and crying afterward." The priest said he could sing. He could not. It was the kind of bad singing that made men nostalgic for silence. But the man had courage that was not from swords, and he had lost more than he would say, and he had learned how to carry water without spilling it. They gave him work teaching letters to children who wanted to make their name look like it sounded, and he did it gladly. When he asked where the sept was, they pointed him to a circle of stones where men went to speak their dead to the air, and he nodded and went and took off his cheap necklace and put it on one of the stones and did not seem to mind. The day the lion sent his first list of needs, He did it by way of a boy who could have been Harold Page's brother if you looked at him from certain angles and chose not to look too closely. The letter said simply, "We have truth still. We have little else. We can send 3 men good with their hands. We need bread." Jon sent the bread. Sansa rolled her eyes and signed the letter and told him he would make a fool of himself if he smiled so much when he read a lion's hand. And he told her that being a fool at the right time was better than any cleverness he had ever found. When spring remembered itself again for the second time, the moot was larger. Men set tents down the lanes with the old windbreak brush, and the sound of argument and making up after argument filled the camp like rain. There were banners on poles that hung limp with damp and banners roughly painted on old planks, and a boy who had made a banner from a wolf's pelt and felt sick about it after and tried to fix it by cutting ears into it so no one would think he had used a wolf. There were women with cords of dried apples, a marvel in that place, and men with knots of salt fish, and a thing someone had made from the scales of that fish that caught the light like coins and was not a coin and would buy you a meal just the same. Sansa stood and spoke with a grace that was not the grace of a court, because this court was the kind men make with their hands. She talked about how to keep the ditch clear when the thaw came and left slush that would freeze again in ugly ways. She talked about the charter. She talked about how to count anything but coin. Sacks lifted, beams cut, mouths fed, knives bandaged and put away again still red. Men who would have slit you for a joke listened to a woman talk about latrines with their heads bent like students. Jon listened and did not need to speak. When the lion's man came in, a stranger with a careful mouth, Sansa greeted him as if she had known him all her life and put him on a bench where the warmth reached. He did not take his gloves off for an hour. In that second spring, a child went missing and the whole camp went out in lines tied with ropes and walked the marshes near the place where the ice broke first. And when they found her, she was asleep against a rock with her thumb in her mouth and a frog by her foot. And the way men cried then and made a joke of it meant more than any oath they had sworn. In that second spring, the blind mason died, and the sound his breath made was like a glass house standing up. And men came to his body and put their hands on the old wood and thanked him without words. In that second spring, a raven came with a blue ribbon, and Jon held it and did not open it for a count of 20. Then did. It said simply, "There is a whisper among the stacks of a second winter. It may be nothing. I hope so. I will come if you ask." He wrote back, "Come when you can, and when you cannot, send a book that will make me a better mason." He went to the wall and touched it and thought of blue. He thought of all the men that story had swallowed and would swallow. He thought how it never leaves and how in the South they call winter a season and not a person. He thought, "I will rebuild what I can, and I will not walk farther than I have to, and that will have to be enough." He let the cold take his palm until he could not feel his fingers, and then he took it away and put it under his arm and waited for the throbbing to find him. He waited with patience because he had learned it. It was not a tale that any of them would hurry to tell to children by a summer stream because it had not much flowing gold in it, and the dragons in it were all 3 made of gorse brush that men had woven together to hide their latrine pits from the children's games. But it was a story men told each other in the dark when it was their turn to keep the watch while the stew settled and the wind talked under the door. It was a story about a place where a man could go with his hands and make things other men could eat. It was a story about not marching and about holding your ground against the hunger that takes men's heads off before their bodies know it has come. It was a story about a girl on a roof of glass, leaning into a boy who had forgotten to frown and reminding him how. On the day they raised the 3rd granary, Tormund climbed to the top of the frame and stood with his hands on his hips and shouted into the clear air like a man letting the wind know who he was. The saws stopped. The hammers quieted. Women looked up with their hands shading their eyes. Children pointed. Ghosts stood and watched, panting a little in what passed for heat. "Look at it," Tormund bellowed. "Look at it, you sorry crow-loving southlings. We made a thing. It will keep bread dry and cold and away from rats and away from men with rings. And if a man comes to light a fire under it, I will piss on him until his hair goes out. Look at it." They looked. Jon stood with his hands on a beam and felt the wood under his palms. The way it had been living once and now would live another way. He looked at Sansa, who was laughing with her head thrown back, and at Ed, who was smiling not with his mouth but with the line between his eyebrows, and at Davos, who was wiping at his eyes as if sawdust had gotten in them. He looked at the lion's envoy standing with his gloves in his hands, and at the girl who had once wanted to be a river, who had not decided against it entirely yet, and might someday turn herself into a thing that carried others without getting herself overly wet. He looked at the wall, which did not look back because the wall did not look at men. Men looked at it. He thought, a king is a thing men make up in their heads to make sense of their fear. A granary is a thing men make with their hands to make sense of hunger. If I can do one and not the other, I will do it. And when the blue comes down again, we will light fires, and we will not march, and we will hold this ground until the bread is gone, and then we will eat our ropes then we will eat our laws, and then we will go into the snow with our mouths full of songs about ropes and laws, and that will be as good a death as any. It was not despair. It was the opposite. When the boy from the Riverlands, Harold Page, who had been hungry and had found work, came to John with a woman on his arm and asked for a blessing, John took their hands in both of his and felt the calluses in their palms. He did not speak words that had made any man king. He said, "May you find work when you wake that makes you tired in the right ways." And they laughed, and the woman kissed him on the cheek, and the whisper went around that he had blessed a marriage, and the children whispered the words to themselves as if they were a prayer. Years went by like that, slow and quick both, like a man counting steps in a snowstorm and then finding himself at a door because he knows the way home in his bones. The gift gathered to itself a shape men could recognize. The free folk built houses with neat embankments and roofs with more than one idea in them, and they put bone charms over the lintels and no one told them not to. The men from the Reach sent not only sawyers but broom makers and cheesemakers, and a woman who could get 40 more eggs out of the same hens by talking to them like equals. The lions sent sons. Some wrote back to their fathers with ink scrawled in a hand you could hardly read because it had been made by a man whose hands were more used to rope than quill. Some did not send letters because they were ashamed that they had not managed to write yet and did not want their fathers to think that they had not thought of them. The marches sent recipes for preserving fruit and honey. No one had enough honey to make the recipes work, but they tried anyway and dared one another and laughed and said they would try again next year. The Iron Bank sent a man who asked polite questions and made more notes than seemed possible, and then asked if he could see a glass house. And when he did, he stood very quietly with his eyes shut as if to count to a number he had never imagined. Sam came, finally, with a cough that made Sansa hand him a scarf, and a woman with hair like the pith of a quince who had sworn to save men's lungs when she could. He stood at the door of the long tent and saw the plank with the charter on it and wept without shame, and when Jon put his arms around him, both men laughed in embarrassment after, and it did not ruin it. Sam stayed a month and taught letters to anyone who asked and showed the council how to keep records in a way that would make sense to men who had never counted beyond fingers. He took a walk to the wall and came back and did not talk about what he had felt when his hand hit the ice. "Do you think it will come again?" he asked Jon when they stood at the edge of the ditch looking north, their breath making white flags in the air. "I think it never left," Jon said. "I think it watches the way you and I do at night, and that is all the difference there is. It is patient. I have learned to be patient. We will see whether patience is greater than hunger." Sam looked at him with a steadiness that was not bookish and said, "I did not think you would learn patience. I thought you were only a sword you could pick up with a hand. I am glad to have been wrong. You are a plow." Jon laughed, startled. "You will make a story of that." "I will make a book of it," Sam said. "And boys will sleep over it in hot rooms and not understand why any of it mattered. And then they will get hungry once in their lives, and it will come back to them, and they will be a little less willing to burn bread." He left at the end of a week with a sack full of letters folded into his pack and a story in his head that would not leave him alone until he pulled it out and made it lie still on paper. Men waved him off from the ditch with jokes about lie and piss, and he waved back, and his shoulders had already forgotten how to hold a sword and remembered how to hold a book, and Ghost went with him to the gate and turned and came back because Jon did not say his name. You could tell the men in the camp who had never known a wolf when they shook their heads at that and tried not to show that it pleased them. One night in the 4th winter, one that came so clean and hard that men tried to chew it and broke teeth on it, the blue light came again on the far side of the wall for an hour and 10 minutes. Magger stood on the top and counted. He had never learned letters, but he had a field man's memory for counting and for distance, and he said to Ed, "It is a breath held and let go again." And Ed said, "I do not like men who breathe near me at night," and neither man laughed. The light was there, and then it was not, and the next morning the air was like glass in the throat, and the mended harness broke on every fifth mule, and children fell and cried and did not know why they were crying. Jon stood with his hand on the wall and felt nothing. It should have soothed him that he felt nothing. It did not. He went back down and had an old woman read him a story about a king who had been kind because he had been old and knew what it cost to be otherwise, and it helped as much as a story will help. There were more attacks like the first and fewer. The word went out that men would hang here for burning bread and live if they fought for it. The kind of men who preferred to live came. Others did not. The lion sent a list in a minute hand that said, "We have truth and 3 boys with good eyes and a girl whose hands work honest. We need seed." The house in the reach that had offered Sawyers sent a second team and a letter with flowers pressed between the paper that had not survived the journey but had left their perfume. The marches sent salt when there was no salt and saved 3 lives with it. The Crannogmen sent words for things that had no words in the north and made men gladder for saying them. When Sansa married, she did it with no crown and a dress that had been patched at the elbows with a fabric finer than the dress itself. She married a man whom the council could approve and trust, and whom she counted rings on and found them gold and paste both. Jon stood with Ghost and watched her promise to keep a ditch clear and to not send letters that would undo work men had done by hand when those men did not deserve undoing, and when she did not cry it pleased and pained him both. He gave her a knife with a haft carved by a boy who had learned to make ropes with 3 hands and a blade made by a man who had learned to make iron from ironwood, ash and hope. And she held it up and laughed because of whose child she had been, and the sound of men laughing back at her was a rich, deep thing that didn't often get made and felt like bread that had risen properly. The girl who had been Gilly and then a road and then a river and then a name again left one spring with a pack and came back in the fall with 40 pages of names written in a strong hand, the names of all the people she had fed and all the people who had fed her. They made a new thing then without knowing it. They made a book of food. They set it on a shelf in the long tent and let men and women come and copy their names into it when they took bread and when they gave it, and the names on a page had the shape of something more than trade. Sansa said, "We have made a realm," and then laughed at herself when she heard the word she had used. "Not a realm," Jon said. "A road that doesn't move." "It moves," she said. "Look," and he did, and he saw people moving along the lanes as water does, shifting around a stone, hurrying when a child cried, making eddies when a woman with a sack ducked under a beam. He saw names shifting into bread and back into names. He saw blue beyond the wall and men on the top of the wall with their faces turned outwards. He saw no crown and did not miss it. He woke sometimes in the night still with a sword in his hand and a cold knowledge lifting its head in his chest like a beast, and he would lie still until it settled, and then he would rise and walk the lanes and listen to the sound men make when they breathe in their sleep. He did not do it because he was a lord. He did it because there are sounds in the world that tell you your work is not done and that you have done some. The wind came under the tent flaps and made whatever was not heavy move, and he put his hand to what moved and held it still, and sometimes that was enough to make the tent sleep again. On the last day of a winter that had spent itself honestly in cold and in hunger and had not lied about either, a raven came with a seal made of nothing at all. No wax, only a twist of thread. The note said, "We broke the kiln. The new one will be better. Tell Davos to send the woman with the 3 lovers. She is better at counting than I am." The hand was careful and round. A girl's. Sansa read it and smiled. "We are repairing the realm from the bottom," she said, amused with herself again. "A good place to start. The top can wait." Jon went out and stood under the old tower with its crown of snow. The boys were making a game of throwing clods at the old sign that had been scraped off, and Ghost watched with interest as if intellectual games interested him. The air smelled like dirt and onion, a rare scent. The wall had a bluish cast that had nothing to do with harm and everything to do with light. Tormund came up beside Jon and put a hand on his shoulder and squeezed once and said nothing, which for Tormund was a speech. Jon stood there with his feet under him and his hands by his sides and felt the world come to him as far as it was able, and he did not move to meet it. He did not need to. He had done that once with a sword and it had been enough then. Now he had a granary behind him and a road around him and a wall at his back and a woman who counted rings, and he belonged to none of them and all of them the way a man belongs to a place when he has put work into it and will never be done. That night, by the hearth, while the stew burbled and a child played with a bit of string and pretended it was a snake, Jon and Sansa and Davos and Ed and the Sawyer Pate and the woman with the 3 lovers and the boy who had fallen in love with Bird sat and talked about the spring to come. Ed said bitter things that were only a little true. Davos told a story about a fishboat that had almost capsized under the weight of laughter and not a fish. Sansa cut bread with the knife Jon had given her and handed slices to each without looking and did not cut her fingers. Ghost fell asleep with his nose touching Jon's boot. "We should build a school," Sansa said, as if it had just occurred to her, and then admitted it had been thinking itself through her head for a week. "Put it over the warm trench. Teach letters. Teach what the blind man taught. Teach how to keep law. Teach how to braid a rope with 3 hands. Teach that bread is not for burning." "We will," Jon said. "We will," Davos said. "We will," Ed said, grudging with his mouth and not with his eyes. "We'll teach them how to sing," Pate said with the innocent faith of a man who could not. And the woman with 3 lovers laughed until the stew slopped and then caught it with her hand and licked it off and said, "We never stop learning anything. We never get to be finished." The wind went on under the door. The wall stood. The blue was patient. So were they. In the morning they rose and put on their boots and went out to meet whatever the snow had done in the night and whatever the men with rings had decided while they slept and whatever the hunger had dreamed. And they did not march. They did not need to. The realm was moving toward them, 1 sack of flour, 1 book, 1 rope at a time. And when men asked him what he had done with the North, Jon would sometimes say the words without pride and without anything. G of apology either, "We kept it. We set bread on it. We swore to be no banner. We raised the granary. We held the ditch." And that, in the end, was crown enough.